Today we're going to cover milestone 3 on the Next Dollar Roadmap, that's paying off toxic debt. Already we've had an intro video covering all 10 steps of the Next Dollar Roadmap at a high level. Then we started with our starting point, which is budgeting. Milestone 1 is your uh-oh fund, which is $1,000 or the value of your highest insurance deductible. And then milestone number 2 was taking advantage of your employer match. Now those videos and all the subsequent videos for the milestones that come after milestone number 3 will be linked down in the description below. As I record the ones that come after this one, I'll add those links. They may not be up right away, but they'll be there eventually. And in case you're new to the Next Dollar Roadmap, it is a 10-step, walkthrough toward financial independence from either a zero net worth or a negative net worth, all the way until step 9, which is financial independence, or milestone 9, which is financial independence. I'd encourage you to just look through the list of 10 milestones that are down below in the description of the video and jump in wherever you feel like you fit. Now coming back to toxic debt, today's milestone. Debt is a topic that generates a wide-reaching variety of opinions about what is and isn't constructive. Now some people despise debt entirely and they believe that $1 of debt is $1 too much, and others just embrace debt like it's air, like they have to have it for everything. Both extremes have their pros and their cons. On the ultra-conservative end, it's not very realistic to expect most people to be able to cash flow major life expenses like education or a house. I mean, it could take years to accumulate the funds for those endeavors, which could severely limit your own quality of life. On the other hand, if you're too eager to utilize debt for general expenses, then even short-lived disruptions to your cash flow could push you over the edge toward bankruptcy and financial ruin. Now, the best metaphor I've ever heard for debt comes from Brian Peterson of the Money Guy Show. He compares it to a chainsaw. You don't need an exceptional imagination to see how effective and useful a chainsaw can be when it's used properly. It can cut through a large tree very quickly. But on the other hand, if you use a chainsaw incorrectly, the consequences of careless use could be gruesome or even fatal. Now, without getting into any further detail into this graphic example, I'll summarize by assuming that we can all agree that debt is something we should handle with care. Now, with that in mind, I want to start by taking a look at different kinds of debt so we can begin to delineate the benefits of debt from its dangers. So in my opinion, the easiest way to highlight the benefits and dangers of debt is to classify it a couple of different ways. Now, there are certainly other approaches to categorizing debt than the next 2 that I'll be presenting, and I'll get to some of those others in a bit. But I think by focusing on just a couple of characteristics of the various types of debt that are out there, we can quickly get a clearer picture of whether or not certain debts are good or bad. And hopefully this will make decisions about debt a little easier for you as you evaluate options yourself. Now first we want to categorize debt as either secured or unsecured debt. Secured debt is money that is loaned to a party and it's backed up or secured by some form of collateral. Mortgages or car loans are very common types of secured debt. Typically, you'll see lower interest rates associated with secured debt because if you fail to pay your lender according to the terms of your loan agreement, they can just seize the collateral, like your house or your car, and they can sell it to recoup the money that they let you borrow. So put another way, the collateral acts as like a backstop or insurance for the lender in case the borrower fails to repay the loan. This significantly lowers the risk for the lender. Now conversely, unsecured debt is debt that is issued without collateral. And as you might guess, unsecured debts typically have higher interest rates because there's higher risk for the lender. Credit cards are the most common example of unsecured debt, but student loans are another major player in this category because lenders can't repossess an education out of your brain. The second way we want to categorize debt is whether or not the money being borrowed is for the sake of buying an appreciating or depreciating asset. An appreciating asset is something that gains value or appreciates in value over time. Houses are a great example of an appreciating asset. Generally, the value of a home tends to increase with time, making it more valuable after years of ownership than when you first purchased it. On the other hand, a depreciating asset is something that loses value or depreciates with time. Cars are the most common examples. Consumer goods also are depreciating assets. So now that we have an understanding of secured versus unsecured debts and appreciating versus depreciating assets, let's take a look at the relationship between these ideas and how they can drive our decisions about debt. All right, on your screen, there's a simple chart illustrating the relationships and highlighting a few of the examples of each type of debt. The hotter colors represent higher risk debts that should be avoided. The cooler colors are debts that are lower risk and represent potentially healthier ways to use leverage. And you can see the 4 quadrants are secured appreciating, secured depreciating, unsecured appreciating, and unsecured depreciating. Now, secured appreciating is the safest and wisest form of debt because having a secured asset that appreciates should allow you to find lower interest rates while also giving you the benefit of capital appreciation. Now, the only way to get into trouble here is if you borrow more than you can reasonably afford to pay back. But even if that happens, you have an appreciating asset that you can sell to get yourself out of the deal. Next is secured depreciating debt. Having collateral can make interest rates for for these loans tolerable, but your overall net worth will still take a hit from this kind of loan because you'll lose money through interest and the depreciating value of the asset. Now, over time, this can add up to hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars. So I would avoid this type of debt if possible. Also, in the use with caution space is unsecured appreciating debts. The fact that these loans are unsecured places most of the risk on the lender, meaning interest rates are typically higher for these loans. And the good news is for you as a borrower is that there's no asset in this case that can be repossessed and sold by the lender. But likewise, there's no asset for you to sell in order to get out of the loan. That means you can find yourself in a great deal of trouble if you aren't wise about borrowing money in this quadrant. The last type of debt is unsecured depreciating debt. This is the riskiest, least desirable form of debt for you as a borrower. Lenders cover their additional risks in this category by charging high levels of interest on the amounts of the loan. Worse yet, as a debtor in this quadrant, you won't be able to sell the assets that you borrowed money to purchase, making it difficult to pay off the loan if you're strapped for cash. If you picture this chart as a funnel toward bankruptcy, this quadrant has the shortest path to financial disaster. It's like right at the bottom of the funnel. You should stay away from it. So hopefully the chart is helpful, but I'll admit it is a somewhat generalized tool for evaluating debt at a very high level. Here's some more direct thoughts and comments I have about common types of debt. First, we'll talk about mortgages. Fixed rate mortgages are an easy yes for me. Homes are the primary net worth building asset for most American families. Obtaining a mortgage is one of the easiest debts to obtain, and they come with many features to keep you out of trouble if you experience financial difficulty. Now, with all that said, you shouldn't borrow money for a house until you can afford it. As a guideline, I recommend keeping the combined cost of housing and transportation below 30% of your monthly income. This is to ensure that you have money left to work on the next milestones as we go through the Next Dollar Roadmap. Another common type of debt is a HELOC or home equity line of credit. HELOCs can be a very useful way to leverage the equity in your home as a quick source of cash. But the interest rates on HELOCs are typically higher than the mortgage, which means you're paying higher interest for debt on the same asset, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, a common practice for many people is to use a HELOC as an emergency fund. The major issue I have with this is that the bank can withdraw that line of credit at any time, meaning it may not be available when you need it most. There are certainly uglier forms of debt than HELOCs, but I recommend avoiding them if at all possible. Next is car loans. I don't ever recommend taking on debt to buy a car. I realize that's not a very common or even popular opinion, but it is based in math. And for more about that, I've got another video that I'll link above. It explains how paying cash for cars over the course of 30 years could result in a net swing of more than $1.14 million in your personal net worth. Next, student loans can be a wise investment in your future. There's no doubt that the long-term benefits of education make post-secondary study a worthwhile pursuit. However, the expectation of a higher salary doesn't necessarily justify taking on unchecked levels of debt. There is a big difference between borrowing $150,000 for a degree in 2nd century Greek architecture and putting yourself through medical school. And to keep your student loans between the guardrails, don't borrow more than 1 to 2 years of your expected salary upon graduation. That will ensure you have enough income to direct toward your loans and start investing if you need to. Next are appliances or furniture loans for these. Don't borrow money for household items. The interest rates for these things is normally pretty high, and it shouldn't take very long to set aside cash to buy these directly instead. Next up is credit cards. While I see a lot of benefit and convenience related to using credit cards to cover day-to-day purchases, you absolutely should not carry a credit card balance from month to month. If you can't pay off your credit cards each month, then you need to chop them up and throw them away. Finally, payday loans. I'm not even sure I'm talking about these except to say stay away from them. They're awful. If you look up predatory lending in the dictionary, there very well may be a photo of a payday loan office next to the definition. Okay, now that we've talked about how to categorize debt, how to identify different types of debt, let's talk about paying it off. So right out of the gate, we defined and discussed secured versus unsecured debts and appreciating versus depreciating assets. And I highlighted these first to point out the types of debt that should be avoided. But now that we're shifting the discussion away from what types of debt to take on to what types of debt to pay off, there's a third delineator I'd like to introduce, and that's toxic versus non-toxic debt. Now, I would define toxic debt as debt that aggressively erodes your net worth because it either has a high interest rate or it's on a quickly depreciating asset or both. Toxic debts represent an urgent priority for your finances because of their highly destructive nature. Typically, you'll find toxic debts in the hotter zones of the heat map I presented earlier. Now, logically, non-toxic debts or good debts are the opposite of toxic debts, and I'm not as concerned with them because they don't cause the same level of personal financial damage as toxic debts. And providing specific criteria for classifying debt as toxic or non-toxic is a bit of a challenge because the standard moves a bit with economic forces. So for example, as I'm recording this in the fall of 2024, you can take out a loan on a new car at around 6% to 16% interest depending on your credit. And just 3 years ago, when my wife and I bought our last car, we were offered a loan with an interest rate of 2.625%. Now, there's a very significant difference in interest rates in only 3 years, and it's also an example of why I can't arbitrarily make suggestions like car loans are toxic, but mortgages aren't, or student loans are great, but HELOCs are the devil. The definition of toxic debt depends on a number of factors like your age, the amount of liquid cash you have available, the asset you're borrowing against, prevailing interest rates, and on and on. And even though I can't completely remove the ambiguity, there are a couple of ways to think about toxic debt. First, the highly subjective but quick way to identify toxic debt is to compare your age and the interest rate of the debt. And using this as a basis, if you're in your 20s and the interest rate on your loan is over 6%, or you're in your 30s and the interest rate is over 5%, or you're in your 40s and the interest rate is over 4%, then I would consider it toxic debt. And if you're in your 50s or older, I generally suggest paying off the debt no matter what it's on. Like I said, that's a quick and dirty way to define toxic debt, and if it works for you, then great. But if I'm being honest, no less than 4 exceptions popped into my mind as I explained the quick and dirty way to identify toxic debt. So if you want a more nuanced answer, the truth is toxic debt could be defined as any debt with an interest rate that exceeds the expected rate of return for any low-risk investments that you would direct the money into if you weren't paying off a debt. Now, I specifically referenced low-risk investments because there isn't any risk to paying off your debt. If you have a loan with a 5% interest rate, then any amount you pay back is going to save you 5%. It's virtually guaranteed. So for example, if you have a mortgage with an interest rate of 3%, and you can reasonably expect an investment that aligns with your chosen asset allocation to outperform the 3% cost of that debt, then you should direct the minimum amount you can toward your mortgage, and any extra cash that you could have used to pay down the mortgage should be used for investing instead. On the other hand, if you had a car loan with an 8% interest rate, then it's toxic, and you should pay it off because you can't reasonably expect an investment to return a guaranteed amount that's greater than 8%. At least not a low-risk investment. For a benchmark of interest rates on low-risk investments, I recommend just looking up treasury yields and just taking whatever yield is associated for whatever treasury instrument has the same timeline as your loan. So if you have like a 3-year loan on a car, you'd want to take a 3-year treasury note and compare the interest rate of that against the rate on your car loan. Or if you had like 22 years left on your mortgage, what is the rate on a 20-year bond? How do those two things compare? Now, these rates change, and as a result, the definition of toxic debt may change with it. But with all these technical explanations aside, I rarely define a conventional mortgage as toxic debt for several reasons. First, mortgages take such a long time to pay off. Even if you aggressively attack the principal, those are years you could be using to get started investing instead. Second, because mortgages are secured debt, they typically have low interest rates compared to other forms of debt, so they're not typically going to rise to that toxic level anyhow. And finally, if you have a high interest rate on a mortgage, you can always just refinance when rates come back down. Now, the truth is, on the other side of that, I rarely consider any other form of debt as non-toxic, with the exception of maybe student loans or medical debts that have low interest rates. If you have any doubts, I would just recommend that you view debt as toxic and pay it off. Now, the final concept I want to cover is how to prioritize the debts you're focused on paying off. There are 2 primary ways to approach eliminating debt. One is called the debt avalanche, and the other is called the debt snowball. Now, the debt snowball method calls for borrowers to pay a minimum monthly balance on each debt. That's all the debts they have. And then any extra money they have to direct toward debt, they'll address those debts in order from the smallest to the largest outstanding amount, regardless of interest rate. Now, this isn't the most efficient and monetarily optimal way to pay off debt, but it does earn you the quickest mental victory to paying off a debt. So if you get a little boost from say just completing a milestone and paying off a debt, and it keeps you going and helps you build momentum, then maybe the debt snowball is the way to go anyway. So to illustrate the debt snowball, I'm going to introduce you to Danny Debtor. He has the following debts: a $30,000 student loan at 5% interest with a monthly minimum payment of $200, a $10,500 car loan with a 6% interest rate and a minimum monthly payment of $250, and finally a $15,000 credit card balance with a 15% interest rate and a minimum monthly payment of $150. So after Danny's made a budget and he's paid for all his monthly expenses, he has $1,500 left each month to direct toward paying off his debts early, in addition to the monthly minimum payment amounts. So using the debt snowball method, Danny would begin by making the minimum monthly payments on the student loan and the credit card before directing the remaining $1,500 toward his car loan. After 7 months, Danny would have eliminated his car loan, incurred a total of $210 in interest on the loan, and begun working toward paying off his credit card debt. With the car loan out of the way, Danny now has an additional $250 a month to direct toward his next debt, which is credit cards. Now paying $1,750 each month, Danny will have his credit cards going in a little over 8 months and incur $1,895.63 in interest. And now Danny has another $150 a month to attack the student loans. Now with $1,900 a month, it would take Danny 15 months to pay off the student loans. However, by paying the monthly minimum for the previous 15 months as he was focused on the car loan and the credit cards, Danny now only owes $27,000. As a result, Danny pays off his student loans in a little over 13 months and incurs $2,672.08 in interest. So all told, using the debt snowball, Danny paid off his debts in about 28.5 months and incurred interest expenses of $4,777.71 during the paydown period. Now, if you want to pay off your debts in the most cost-effective manner, then the debt avalanche is the way to go. Now, using the debt avalanche method, you'll contribute the minimum payments on each debt, then contribute the remainder to your highest interest debt regardless of the amount before moving on to the second highest rate and so on. So as a result, each dollar you contribute to debt paydown has the biggest possible impact because it's paying off borrowed amounts at the highest interest rates. Now going this route, it may take you longer to pay off your debts, meaning it may take longer to get that mental boost or that victory that you're looking for, but it is the most cost-effective way to go. So looking at Danny's debts again, he's got the $30,000 student loan, the $10,500 car loan, and the $15,000 credit card debt. This time he's going to start with credit cards since the interest rate is the highest. It takes Danny 10 months to eliminate the credit card debt, and he incurs $1,031.25 in interest while he's paying it off. He moves on to the car loan after that, and Danny pays it off 4 months later, and he incurs interest charges of $551.25. And finally, Danny pays off the student loans after an additional 15.5 months and incurs interest expenses of $2,678.33. So all told, Danny pays off the same debts in 29.5 months at a total interest cost of $4,260.83. So by using the debt avalanche, Danny took roughly an extra month to pay off the debt, but it saved him a total of $516.88 in interest over the paydown period. Now Danny is a simple example. The interest costs and paydown periods could vary greatly depending on your situation, but hopefully this gives you some idea of how these paydown methods work. And this was a lot of information about debt, and I hope you found it helpful. And paying off debt is probably the toughest lift on the entire Next Dollar roadmap. It's not a lot of fun directing your available cash into something that you don't see a real tangible benefit from, because the money you borrowed for whatever asset, you've already got the asset. Also, depending on your past financial choices, this milestone could take quite a bit of time to complete. But the feeling when you finish will be totally worth it. Having more disposable income that you can begin to put to work on your behalf is incredibly refreshing, and the journey quickly improves from there. Now, the next stop on the Next Dollar roadmap is milestone number 4, which is a fully funded emergency fund. As always, I'm grateful for your interest. God bless and take care.